All right. So let's talk about ancestors. Paleontologists have long discussed ancestor-descendant relationships. Basically, you can go back through the literature and you can find many, many papers where there's diagrams like this depicting what people argued were the ancestor-descendant relationships among the taxa they were studying in the fossil record. Well, let's just talk a little bit about what the nature of this data is. Basically, paleontologists go to the fossil record, they go look at some stratigraphic beds, and they'll find some specimens that look very, very similar across a number of these beds, which might be across millions of years, and then they'll group those together and they'll say that's a morphotaxon. And that's a morphotaxon, it's got some duration over some extent of geologic time. And then there's sort of an implicit assumption there, an implicit assumption that is basic to the vast majority of paleontology, which is that within these morphotaxa, the specimens form some sort of singular lineage of ancestors and descendants over time. And it's pretty critical to everything from analytical paleobiology to biostratigraphy, which is how we get oil. And it's really never tested. But the assumption is, oh yes, all of these specimens, they all form one sort of unbroken lineage. Now, we also talk a lot about the ancestor-descendant relationships among morphotaxa, but generally this is all qualitative. When I was an undergrad, I remember I once asked the guy I worked with, hey, how do we get ancestors? He's like, you don't, it's all witchcraft. And that's basically it. Like, all of these diagrams, they're basically drawn by hand. They're pencil on paper. There's no analysis here. People just look at the morphologies, they say they're similar, they look at the order in the fossil record, they say that's an ancestor-descendant relationship. And in some groups that are studying the fossil record, particularly invertebrates and microfossils, that's really common. Well, why is it you don't want to read the fossil record literally? Okay, so here's one of my groups I really like. One that no one can argue with me about the relationships among them, and so they're great for theoretical examples. So, why can't you read the fossil record literally? Well, let's say you've got some pattern of ancestor-descendant relationships. In an incompletely sampled fossil record, it could be really hard to reconstruct which are the ancestors and which are the descendants. So what do we do about that? Well, one method historically that came up to try to quantitatively deal with this was stratocladistics, where we said, okay, there's going to be some gaps in the fossil record, and we're going to try to weigh those against the character information. Stratocladistics tried doing it by actually equating the gaps, some amount of gap in the fossil record versus some number of character changes as measured under parsimony. I think a lot of people are always very uncomfortable with that sort of equivalency. Really, you need some sort of formal model of diversification and sampling in the fossil record so you can weigh that against the probability of character changes. Well, today we've got Bayesian tip dating. So, Bayesian tip dating, we can take our morphological data, we can take data about when particular taxa occur in the fossil record. We can use a formal model of diversification and sampling, i.e. the fossilized birth-death model, and we can calculate trees that include fossil taxa that take into account the incompleteness of the fossil record and actually weigh it on an even playing ground, even ground against the character change. And even greater, we have sampled ancestor tip dating, which means that we allow that tips might actually be in the direct lineage, ancestral to other taxa that we've included in our data set. So we're now in the age of where we can do ancestor inference, and that's pretty revolutionary, at least from the perspective of paleontological phylogenetics, where talking about what might actually be an ancestor was pretty much, that was taboo for the last few decades. So now we can talk about that. And not talk about it in just a qualitative sense, actually put numbers on it. What's the support of something being an ancestor? So this is some work that I've been involved in the last year. So for example, in one paper we looked at a number of different tip dating and tip dating-like methods. They inferred very similar ancestors, which taxa were the ancestors. We also looked at a data set of, trilobites with one collaborator, and we found that the qualitative ancestor-descendant pairs that people had argued for before in the fossil record, there was actually quantitative support for those pairs. Okay, but there's an issue. The vast majority of tip dating analyses that have been done out there basically take morphotaxa, things that are actually found multiple times throughout the fossil record, and treat them as a single point in time. And that's problematic because, one, the fossilized birth death model kind of assumes you have all the occurrences, and two, treating them as single points in time doesn't allow you to capture the full range and variety of ancestor-descendant relationships that might exist in the fossil record. So, obviously there's some issues with that. So what happens if maybe we go looking for a data set where someone has actually decided to sit down and try to code out all the different occurrences of a taxon? Maybe not exhaustively, but as many as that they could really bother to sit through and code out. Well, there's different variety of ancestor-descendant relationships. One that paleontologists often talk about is anagenesis, where a lineage sort of changes into another morphotaxon without really a branching event. You can also imagine there's some sort of budding pattern where there's some ancestral lineage and other lineages branch off of it over time. Now, previous analyses have found more evidence for the budding pattern, and that's important because that would actually imply that maybe there's something necessary about branching events for there to be morphological change, the sort of morphological change that we would associate with a new morphotaxon originating. It would also mean that Phylogenetic change at branching events was asymmetric, that you generally get some sort of ancestor left over. All right, evidence for budding is pretty easy because if we have multiple occurrences of taxa, if the ancestor is paraphyletic, well then that's a budding relationship. The problem is that anagenesis in an incomplete sampled fossil record is really easily confused with budding. And so there's sort of, it's easier to recognize anagenesis than budding. So you can get a minimum estimate of sort of budding, but then you can get sort of a maximum estimate of anagenesis. So budding can end up looking like anagenesis and not vice versa. All right, so here's a data set where someone actually decided to sit down and code out a bunch of occurrences, and this is Gene Hunt's Phylogenetic data set. And he was rewarded for coding out all of these occurrences with a fairly unresolved maximum parsimony cladogram, which he then grouped together into more regular morphotaxa. So if we take that data and we put it into a tip data analysis with Mr. Bayes, we get out a tree like this, and what we see is that it's actually very similar to the tree that Gene got as the end product, but some of those morphotaxa actually come out as paraphyletic, basically as budding ancestors to other morphotaxa that he had in his data set. We also, a number of those occurrences end up falling directly out of the lineages as sampled ancestors. So, those sorts of data sets are actually kind of rare in paleontology. We don't generally code out all the occurrences, particularly in invertebrates and microfossils, because we have a lot of specimens. What generally people do is they code out the characters for a single morphotaxon based upon a small number of specimens, but pretty much we code out the characters that aren't changing over those morphotaxa. Because if there were characters that changed, we would consider a different morphotaxa, right? It's a loop. Well, so what are we going to do? Well, how are we going to deal with the fact that we actually kind of want to include multiple occurrences for each morphotaxon? Well, we could duplicate taxa, include both the first and the last occurrences as different operational taxon units in the matrix, and then give those different ages assigned to the first and last occurrence. So we did this for 3 different genus-level data sets for mid-Paleozoic brachiopods, the pterobrachylids, pentamerids, and stenoschismatoids. In order to automate this process, I've written a number of R functions that basically can take your data, take your age data, and sort of spit out for you a pretty ready-to-use Nexus file for running in Mr. Bayes. And you can go get those functions off my GitHub repo for Paleotree if you want to use them. Okay, so here's an example. Here's the maximum plate compatibility tree for the Devonian pterobrachylid analysis, and we see a number of genera that now come out as paraphyletic to other genera in the data set, and also a number of those first occurrences are coming out as sampled ancestors of the last occurrence, kind of reaffirming that idea of whether or not morphotaxa are ancestor-descendant lineages. But how does this actually vary across the posteriors from our data sets? So across these 3 groups of brachiopods, we see that about 10 to 50% of the operational taxon units we've used come out as sampled ancestors. The majority of those are first occurrences. In fact, there's a pretty low level of last occurrences coming out as sampled ancestors, and basically a last occurrence would have to be a sampled ancestor for you to argue for anagenesis. So this puts a pretty low limit on how much actual anagenesis could be occurring in our data set. Now, the majority of those sampled ancestors are first occurrences, and they're occurring basically as ancestors to the last occurrence as a descendant. So again, that sort of reaffirms that, yeah, maybe morphotaxa are kind of these cohesive ancestor-descendant lineages. Note particularly, there's a lot of variation here among the data sets. Even though these are three pretty similar groups of mid-Paleozoic brachiopods, and these aren't groups where phylogenetics has really been used to how genera are going to be defined, but maybe just figuring out sort of higher level relationships. The Pentamerids have a pretty high level of the first occurrences being ancestral to the last occurrences, which you don't see in the other two groups. And similarly, the Pentamerids also fall out as having a very low level of paraphyletic taxa. The genera mostly fall out as monophyletic in our tree posterior from these tip dating analyses. Meanwhile, in the pterobrachioids and the scenoschismatoids, we see that there's about as high level of paraphyly among the genera as we saw the last occurrences being sampled ancestors, right? So the one is a maximum limit on anagenesis. This is a minimum limit on how much budding there could be. And they're coming out to be about the same numbers, so probably there's more budding going on than anagenesis. So, you know, this is big to me, because this is like, how we've done systematics in paleontology really has never changed that much, but in the last few years it has changed dramatically. And now we can talk about things that we never even imagined we could talk about in a quantitative sense, ancestor-descendant relationships. And if we treat fossil morphotaxa as more than just a single OTU limited to a point occurrence in time, we can get at a whole set of questions about how these morphotaxa that we study in the fossil record, that are the basis for our morphological studies and diversification studies, about how they're actually related to each other in this fabric of ancestor-descendant relationships. And in well-sampled groups like invertebrates and microfossils, I think this is a really interesting question that people have wanted to ask for a long time. We definitely see evidence that, yeah, morphotaxa are maybe these cohesive lineages, but maybe not always. The first occurrence wasn't always coming out as a sampled ancestor to the last occurrence. And that's, you know, something to think about, is that even in these groups where maybe sampling is really great, maybe the first occurrence isn't necessarily an ancestor to all the descendants. As I said, like there seems to be more evidence for budding than anagenesis once you consider that budding can look like anagenesis but not vice versa. And there is considerable variation among these groups, even though they're very similar invertebrate groups from the mid-Paleozoic. So, thank you all for listening, and I'll take any questions. Charles?
Have you tried comparing the proportion of ancestors you get with what Lightfoot would have predicted based on the preservation rate of the taxa?
No, I haven't, but I mean, it should come out as pretty similar since it's still all a model with Poisson processes of birth, death, and sampling, right? It's all, in some ways, basically a very similar model.
Okay.
April?
So were there any taxa that you really did expect to come as a sample descendant of an ancestor that's on the tree that didn't? And were there any, for those taxa, were there any uniting characteristics?
I'm not certain for these brachiopod groups that there's any detailed expectations of ancestor-descendant relations. Sandy's shaking her head no. So, no, that we were able to look at that in the pterocephalid trilobites, but not in this group.